Yeah, oh yeah, okay, that was fine. Yeah.
You are muted.
Okay. Okay. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, today I'll be discussing about describing equity impacts and trade-offs. This is the chapter of distributional cost effectiveness analysis. And I'm not afraid to say that I found it quite complex to understand the concept that have been highlighted in this chapter. And at the end of presentation, I don't expect you to be very clear based on my presentation, but I will be sharing my learnings based on this book. So in the presentation today, I'll be discussing about my understanding of the basic difference of conventional cost effectiveness analysis and the distributional cost effectiveness analysis. I will also discuss about quantifying equity impacts. I found two approaches, level egalitarian and change egalitarian approach. I'll be discussing briefly about these approaches. And the population of interest in describing equity impacts, equity relevant variables. I will touch briefly on this side as well. The need for distribution adjustment and equity impact analysis, and also the time horizon of measurement, approaches in evaluating equity impacts, some ethical principles that may somehow guide us in making comparison of the distribution, and finally, I will touch the topic of visualizing equity efficiency trade-off. So let's start with the conventional CA and distributional CA. So what I found is like the conventional CA focuses more on the incremental changes, the incremental cost, and the incremental benefits or the effects. So in addition to this, distributional cost effectiveness analysis also is interested in the level of health and somehow takes into consideration the equity impacts of the intervention. And this is the fundamental difference I found between conventional CA and the distributional CA. So there are two approaches in quantifying the equity impacts, the level egalitarian approach and the change egalitarian approach. The level egalitarian approach, what we do here in level egalitarian approach is like we compute the index of inequality before we made the decision. We compute the index of inequality after we made the decision, and we see how these two indices differ. So we compute the difference in two index of inequalities. However, slightly different, the change egalitarian approach, we compute the index of inequality on the incremental net health benefit variable. So when we are particularly interested on or particularly concerned about the inequality in health, level egalitarian approach is slightly more preferred. Let me make it slightly more clear based on an example. The chart I have prepared here deal about the institutional delivery, for example, let's say. There are differences in the institutional delivery rates in urban, peri-urban, and rural setting before the intervention or before the decision we made. So we compute the index of inequality of the institutional delivery before the intervention based on place of residence. And then we again compute the index of inequality on the place of based on place of residence after the intervention. So we have two indices and we compare how, what changes have we made in these two indices. So we compute the difference between these two. And another approach that change egalitarian adopts is like we compute the difference we have made in urban. We have compute the difference that we have made in urban, peri-urban, and rural setting. For example, let's say in urban, the institutional delivery rates improve by 10 points. For example, in peri-urban, it improves by 15 points, or maybe in the rural setting, we improve by 20 points. So we have the change variable. We compute the index of inequality based on that change variable under change egalitarian approach. One of the fundamental understanding about reducing inequality is like reducing inequality requires larger benefits for the disadvantaged group of population. That's quite fundamental understanding, I believe. And so we discussed about two approaches in quantifying the equity impacts. Other concern that comes in mind is the population of interest. Which populations should we consider while analyzing equity? Not just the intended recipient population, but the overall target population that is served by the organization or the ministry or the department should be considered in equity analysis. For example, let's say if we have a program, a national HIV program, let's say, then it is not normally sufficient to describe the effects of intervention among the recipient subgroup of the HIV positive patient. The ministry resources can be scattered across different programs, and it would be beneficial to see how severely ill HIV patient serve or compare against other disease, patient from other disease, which could be potentially benefited from the resources that was somehow diverted in the HIV control program. So the population of interest is not the exact recipient of the intervention, but the wider target population that is served by the organization. So in the previous slide, we discussed about the institutional delivery in urban, peri-urban, and rural setting that was based on place of residence. There are several other variables that may be important while analyzing equity, or we call it equity-relevant variables. Apart from place of residence, we have a mnemonic progress plus. The other variables could be race, ethnicity, culture, language, or for occupation, gender, sex, religion, education, socioeconomic status, and social capital. In addition, depending upon the nature of outcome variable, we may also be interested in age group, types of disability, as well as the adverse experiences. So these are the variables that may be important from the equity perspective. There may be some additional variables as well, depending upon the nature of intervention, as well as the nature of outcome variable. So we discussed about different variables that may be useful in analyzing the equity, but there are some other factors that needs to be adjusted when we analyze the equity impacts. The one of the reason that we make adjustment while analyzing the equity impacts is that we are particularly interested in differences in health that are unfair. All differences in health are not inequitable. As equity analyst, we are more focused on the unfair sources of variation. So we have to make adjustment for the fair sources of variation. For example, let's say while studying the inequalities and consequences in health, we may have to adjust for the age composition of the population. We can't expect a 90-year-old person to be performing as better as 15-year-old adolescent. And this is largely based on hormone biology over which we have no control over. So we have to make adjustment in the age distribution or age composition of the population when we compare the consequences on health. Well, while studying the inequality in service utilization, we may also choose to adjust for underlying disease pattern in the society or the subgroups. This is particularly because the less service utilization not only means that they don't have access to the health services, but it may be the case that they have less need of the curative health services. They may be relatively healthy and may be requiring less hospital visits than the other population. So while analyzing the inequalities in health service utilization, we may also choose to adjust for inequalities or the underlying morbidity pattern of the disease in the community. Apart from this, there are several other factors that we may have to consider, we may have to adjust while analyzing equity. Sometimes it's about choice and responsibility. For example, we can compare the road traffic accident among general population with those involved in car racing or motorbike racing. So that is choice, and some differences are fair. And sometimes it's about luck, maybe good or bad, maybe fortunate or unfortunate events, but we have no control over such events. Sometimes the situation is like we know one segment of population is suffering more than other, but we have no idea about the preventive approaches, or we have no idea about the treatment available, or available healthcare technologies. With available healthcare technologies, we can't offer any treatment to the population, although we know that they are bearing the unfortunate events or they are bearing higher burden of the disease. And one of the complex concept is the compensability. Sometimes a segment of population may have additional benefit that is somehow nullified by the additional harm that they have been encountering. For example, male population throughout the world have a slightly shorter life expectancies, but they enjoy the better social advantage, higher social status, better social exposure. So the net positive aspect and the negative aspect are somehow supposed to nullify, and these differences are somehow considered to be fair. So we also may have to consider these factors while analyzing the equity impacts. And we discussed about the different variables that may be interesting from the equity perspective. We discussed about the factors that we may have to adjust while analyzing equity. And the other thing that we need to discuss is about the time horizon. How long do we observe after the intervention for the potential benefits? That largely depends on the nature of intervention or the disease. For example, let's say if it's the intervention is about the diarrheal disease, after 1 week of intervention, the person may return to perfect health and no benefits may be realized beyond 1 week. But if it's about cancer, the individual may have lifetime benefits and we may have to observe the individual for the whole life, or maybe like 10 years or 5 years. So the decision largely depends on the intervention and the disease itself. And if we decide to observe for the lifetime, the other question that comes is which data, which information should we use? The information available at the very beginning, at the middle of life, or at the end of life? So I believe we don't have a clear-cut answer for these questions, but these questions need to be settled at the very beginning when we design the equity analysis, or when we come together to decide the methodology for equity analysis. There are some summary measures that help us quantify the equity. And one of the measure is inequality indices. As the name signifies, this measure is particularly interested in measuring the distribution in terms of inequality, and particularly useful when we are interested in equity impacts. Lorenz curve is one of the approach, one of the example of inequality indices that graphically presents the inequality measurement. So in addition to inequality, social welfare indices also takes into consideration the efficiency aspect. And we would choose to consider social welfare indices when we are particularly interested in trade-off of the equity and efficiency. So Atkinson's index is one of the example of social welfare indices that somehow assigns equity weight and the variable based on level of health. So other approach to assign equity weights is rank-based equity weights and level-based equity weights. Among these two, level-based equity weights is slightly more preferred because rank-based equity weights, when we assign rank-based equity weights, rank itself is an ordinal variable with limited statistical strength. And there are two approaches in evaluating equity impacts. One is grand optimum approach and the reasonable compromise. So I say like a grand optimum is slightly more quantitative approach where we try to exactly quantify the equity and efficiency impact, and the resulting numerical figure guides our decision. So this, I don't know the details about this particular grand optimum approach. That will be dealt in separate chapter under evaluating distribution. The reasonable compromise seems slightly more pragmatic to me, where we accept that equity and efficiency impacts are not ideal, and we may have to reach a negotiated compromise in the trade-off. So it seems like for this level of efficiency, we may have to compromise equity to this level, or in the reverse way, to achieve this level of equity, we may have to compromise the efficiency by this number. So there are some ethical axioms or principles that somehow help us compare the distribution. One of the principle is Pareto principle or health monotony principles that often appears in the book of health economics. I won't be able to deal in details about these, but you may go back to the literatures. But if I share my understanding, if at least one person has more HALIs, and no one has fewer, then the distribution is judged as better. So at least one person should have more, but no one should have fewer. And the other health transfer principle is slightly more complex, where if HALIs are redistributed from more healthy to less healthy, the distribution is considered equal unless provided that the HALIs transfer and do not exceed the initial differences. It's slightly more complex. You may choose to go back to the literatures for having more idea about these topics. Yeah. And this is the last topic I'll be covering in today's presentation. There are two approaches in visualizing equity and efficiency trade-off. One is equity weighted net benefit plot. An equity weighted net benefit plot shows the degree of inequity aversion required to consider an option as a better alternative. So what level of inequity aversion is needed to consider an option as a better option? That is the question that equity weighted net benefit plots seek to answer. There's social indifference curve in equity efficiency impact plane, which shows whether the option is better than the baseline comparator, given the level of inequality aversion and the set equity weights. So I will just display how the equity weighted net benefit plots look like. This is the equity weighted net benefit plots. This plot facilitates the comparison, or let's say with this plot, one can compare 1 unit of equity weighted net benefit to 1 standard unit of the benefit. So we have two lines here, intervention X and intervention Y. Intervention X is cost effective but equity harming. Intervention Y is cost ineffective but equity enhancing option. The next approach and visualization of the equity efficiency trade-off is this plot, where as we go up, there's improvement in efficiency, and as we go from left to right, there is improvement in equity. So there is a lose-lose quadrant. This intervention, where the intervention compromise both the equity and efficiency. There is win-win quadrant, where the intervention enhance equity as well as efficiency. And there is indifference curve, indifference line, where we may have to make a compromise on equity in improving efficiency, or we may have to compromise efficiency while improving equity. So based on the equity weights we assign, the program may appear in the right or left of the social indifference line. So if we assign strong equity weights, the equity impact, negative equity impacts may seem slightly higher. And if we assign lower equity weight, the negative impact on equity may seem slightly less. And this is the final slide I have. So in the presentation today, we discussed about the approaches in measurement and the visualization of equity and the equity efficiency trade-offs. And what I felt is the policymakers would want headline findings about the equity and equity efficiency trade-off, and they would be less interested in the complicated data. Sometimes we may have, rather than having a complicated measurement of the inequity, sometimes we may simply go for a dashboard that somehow presents the disaggregated data by different strata or different variables. Value maximization, improving total population health, or reducing unfair differences are the policy objectives, and balancing that trade-off is important to maximize the social welfare. So this is the end of my presentation. So if there are any concerns, then you may pose the questions.
We clap here from Bergen.
Thank you.
Really impressive early in your PhD career, being able to summarize a very complicated topic. And it's perfectly fine if those of you listening to Achyut, and I expect you have tried to read the chapter and struggled a bit. So maybe you just almost understand it, and that's where we should be. Then we are pushing the front of equity efficiency trade-offs.